Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. It began with the melt. In the far north, where winter fights harder each year to keep its claim, the ice pulled back. Not by storms or seasons, but by time, slow, unbending, silent. What remained beneath had not seen light since the Paleolithic. A ridge collapsed under its own weight, revealing not bones, not wood, not stone. Something else. The excavation was routine, commissioned by a research team surveying glacial retreat patterns along the Yukon border. For weeks, they recorded sediment cores and photographed retreat lines. Nothing remarkable. Just another dataset added to the archive of a changing Earth. Until the shovel struck something it shouldn't have. At first glance, it resembled slag, dull, gray, featureless. But it gave no sound when tapped. It resisted heat, resisted cutting, resisted classification. It was not from any known category of natural formation. And it was heavy. Too heavy for its size, denser than steel but unmagnetized. Its surface was cold, colder than the surrounding ice, as if it hadn't noticed the thaw. They photographed it, bagged it, logged it like any other anomaly. No celebration. No fear. Just a quiet note in a field report marked unidentified sample, metallic, possible industrial origin. But one of them had seen something. A contour beneath the sediment just before it was lifted. A curve too precise. A pattern that didn't belong. Transport took 3 days by snowtrack. The nearest lab with suitable containment was in Montreal. The object was stored in a cold vault while documentation was prepared. No alarm was raised. No red flags. No one had yet asked the only question that mattered. How long had it been there? It was the intern, not the lead geologist, who suggested dating the surrounding organic matter. A formality, really. To settle a bet. The sediment sample yielded a result within standard deviation, but still enough to raise a brow. 41,230 years. Plus or minus 80. That's when the silence began to change. Not externally. Not in words. Internally, among those who had touched it, moved it, labeled it as unknown. They started going back over photographs, rechecking logs. Not because of what it was, but because of what it couldn't be. A manufactured object, sealed in sediment from the Upper Paleolithic, uncorroded, composed of elements fused in ways no natural process could explain. Something once buried under ice deeper than memory. And no footprints leading in. No trail out. The object had been waiting. Waiting in a place that no memory could recall, no map had recorded, no story had prepared them for. Not hidden. Not buried. Present. Silent. Until the Earth, without permission or plan, began to thaw its secrets loose. And that was just the first question. They thought it was debris. A misplaced shard from some forgotten aerospace experiment, maybe a prototype payload casing torn free during descent, scattered across the continent by stratospheric wind and time. The shape fed the assumption. Angular, deliberate, sharp where it needed to be, smooth where it shouldn't have been. Nothing organic. No weld seams. No fractures. No sign it had ever endured impact, wear, or purpose. It was catalogued under industrial waste, flagged for forensic metallurgy, and boxed in foam for transport. The report marked it anomalous but non-critical. No protocols were activated. It moved quietly. Montreal took it next. A standard intake at the University Materials Lab. 2 security signatures. No escort. Stored beneath fluorescent lights and dusted with antiseptic powder, the object waited again. Only this time in silence with names. No one noticed the weight at first. Not the number, but the sensation. You could hold it in 2 hands, but it settled into the body like stone. There was no distribution. No balance. The object simply existed, unresponsive to the hands that carried it. That bothered the technician more than the geometry. Dimensions were noted. 12.7 centimeters long, 6.2 wide, depth tapering at irregular intervals. The corners were too clean. Not factory clean, uncorrupted. No scrape marks. No weathering. No pitting from moisture or temperature cycling. Just surface. The initial scan returned no serial numbers. No embedded identifiers. No stamps, engravings, or brandings that would point to manufacture, origin, or ownership. Standard protocol was to vapor analyze the surface. When they did, the machine hesitated. The chemical report identified tungsten and hafnium in quantities beyond standard industrial composition, layered with carbon in a configuration that didn't match anything commercially available. Nanostructures were present, not decorative, not functional, just there. Too orderly for nature. Too patternless for design. They magnified it at 2,000 times. Across one face, etched shallowly into the metal surface, were lines. Not scratched. Not carved. Embedded. 8 straight cuts, each intersecting in angles too specific to be random, yet too inconsistent to be repeated. A code or a coincidence, no one knew. There was no reaction to temperature, no magnetic alignment. The object remained inert across the spectrum. It did not reflect heat. It did not retain static charge. When pressed, it pressed back with no elasticity, no vibration, no shift in frequency or tone. One student said it looked like a part of something larger. Another disagreed. Whatever this was, it didn't belong to anything else. It had finished being part of something long ago, if it ever had. They tested for radiation. The counters stayed flat. They exposed it to UV. Nothing. They struck it with a diamond-edge stylus. No mark. The object held. Not just against inquiry, but against meaning. It offered nothing to interpretation. It didn't signal. It didn't reject. It just was. Some thought it might be a fake, crafted as a hoax. But there were no welds, no assembly points, no indication of human tools, not even microscopic residuals. Its silence wasn't indifference. It was final. They logged the findings, archived the scans, and assigned it a case number. Routine. Still, something lingered after each examination. A pause. A glance over the shoulder. An unfamiliar weight behind the eyes. As if the object had shown them nothing, and in doing so, taken something instead. They hadn't asked where it came from. Not really. Not yet. They would. The first test was standard. A sample of plant fibers scraped from the inner sediment, preserved beneath the object, isolated, sterilized, packed in foil, sent to the carbon lab across the corridor. They weren't looking for answers, just context. A timestamp. A frame around the anomaly. Something to tell them how long it had been buried, not what it meant. The result returned 41,230 years. Margin of error, 80. The technician read it twice. Not because the number was difficult to understand, but because nothing in the room prepared him for it. The test was rerun, same procedure, same material. A second result confirmed the first. The sample wasn't contaminated. The method hadn't failed. It should have ended there. Strange, yes, but explainable. Ice traps things. Debris moves. Stratification can lie. That's what they told themselves. But the sediment had been undisturbed. No layering irregularities. No intrusion points. No ice lensing, no melt tunnels, no upward drift. The organic matter was packed beneath the object, not above, not beside. It hadn't slid into place. It hadn't been washed in. The object had been there when the sediment formed. That was no longer theory. It was position. It was depth. It was sequence. They turned to the object next. Thermal radiation scan, alpha emission, beta decay, gamma response. Nothing. The material was stable. Inert. It held no radiological fingerprint. It did not contain measurable isotopes suitable for dating. It was beyond that. Not too old, not too degraded. Just incompatible with every method they had. A closed book with no title, no language, no paper. So they looked around it. They began to test the clay surrounding the site sample. The crust was undisturbed, the layering consistent with glacial flow from over 40 millennia ago. Pollen spores matched the period. Even the isotopic oxygen balance in the ice layers aligned with a time when mastodons had walked across what is now the Yukon. Everything agreed except for the object. It was new. Not new in the archaeological sense, not something merely younger than the strata, but absolutely wrong. It had no place in that layer. Its very existence contradicted the order of the Earth. It would have required metallurgy thousands of centuries ahead of the Copper Age. It would have required knowledge of molecular engineering, cryogenic stasis, synthetic pressure modeling, concepts that hadn't even formed yet in language, let alone in craft. It would have required something impossible. They tried to construct a failure. A way the data could have lied. Instrument drift. Mislabeling. Core contamination. None held. Every double-check led back to the same junction. This object, fabricated through artificial processes, had been sealed beneath Earth's surface since before recorded time. The silence in the lab thickened. Not disbelief, but the absence of speech that forms when belief isn't an option anymore. One of the researchers stayed late and ran a density scan across the remaining core section. Something caught his attention, an irregularity in the grain direction of the sediment, bending slightly near the base of the artifact. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't fault. It was as if the surrounding matter had settled around something that hadn't belonged there. Not dropped, not buried, but caught in the middle of a formation process that never should have included it. Not an object misplaced. An object mistimed. No one wanted to say it. No one was ready to pull that word into the room. Not yet. It stayed unspoken, sitting behind their teeth like a loaded question. Because if the object was real, and the dating was true, then what had waited in the ground wasn't ancient. It was premature. The report was submitted, reviewed, and tabled without urgency. A dozen pages, tightly written, fully sourced, modest in tone. It reached the committee with no headline, no alarm. Just another anomaly to be interpreted, explained, folded back into the slow rhythm of geological consensus. The object was entered into the log as undetermined origin, probable misplacement. The panel convened 2 weeks later. Remote participants joined from 5 institutions. Most had not read the findings beyond the abstract. A few had skimmed the data tables. One asked if the organic dating had been cross-validated. Another questioned the sampling depth, citing pressure displacement and cryofracture as possible artifact. The phrase, equipment miscalibration, appeared 4 times in the note. One voice objected. She had run the test. Not once. Not twice. She had rerun them 11 times, under changing conditions, alternating labs, rotating instrument. Control samples had matched across the board. Isotopic decay had followed expected curve. The object had not moved. The sediment had not shifted. No disturbance, no intrusion, no biological contamination. Nothing to explain it. Nothing to forgive it. She explained again that the artifact had not been introduced. It had been encased. The surrounding matrix had conformed to its shape, not adjusted after the fact. It was not resting in the layer. It had become part of it during formation. The arguments returned politely, firmly. Thermal anomalies could cause layering irregularities. Glacial slip could conceal post-depositional drift. Unrecorded human activity could account for industrial debris buried below depth. The possibilities were endless, so long as one refused to accept the result. No one accused her of fabrication. That would have required a willingness to believe she cared enough to lie. What they suggested instead was more comfortable. A mistake. A small oversight. A blind spot. The idea that she might be correct was treated as improbable not because the evidence lacked rigor, but because the conclusion carried weight no one wished to hold. She left without comment. That night, she requested access to the storage vault and removed one fragment of the object's lower faceplate. The procedure was logged under follow-up analysis. No one stopped her. No one followed. She placed the fragment into a hardened carry case, sealed it under nitrogen, booked a flight under her own name, and disappeared into economy seating with a suitcase that no longer matched its contents. There had been a name once. Someone she had worked with during postdoctoral research. He ran a precision lab in Zurich now. Low visibility. High accuracy. Unaffiliated with institutions that cared about professional embarrassment. She did not request approval. She did not send an email. Some discoveries are not shared. Not at first. Not because they are dangerous, but because the world is often too slow to listen. Because noise will always drown out signal until the signal makes itself undeniable. And sometimes, to hear it clearly, someone must choose silence first. As the aircraft climbed, a vibration passed through the fuselage. Nothing abnormal. Just routine turbulence. She felt it in her knees more than her spine. Reached down to touch the case by her feet. It didn't move. It never did. She closed her eyes and remembered the carbon reading. 41,000 years. No error. No drift. Just a number that had no right to exist beside the thing she had carried through airport security without a single question asked. She had crossed through the first layer of disbelief. Others would follow. But only if they were ready to abandon the question of how long it had been buried, and ask instead when it had been made. The machine didn't fail. It paused. The spectrometer ran its sequence twice before displaying the result. The technician thought it was a power fault. The numbers weren't scrambled. They were complete, just wrong. Too heavy on hafnium, too precise in its distribution. The peaks were clean, but didn't align with any catalogued alloy. There were no impurities. No signature of industrial tolerance. No residue from thermal exposure. No evidence of casting, welding, or extrusion. The lattice wasn't bonded. It was grown. The sample was sliced under vacuum and sent through scanning electron arrays. Cross-sectioned at nanometer resolution. No delamination. No crystalline fractures. No transitional boundary between material type. The tungsten was layered with graphene in a repeating formation that formed a radial pattern, one not found in natural deposition or current metallurgical design. The geometry didn't match utility. It matched intent. A second scan was ordered with increased magnification. That's when they saw it. Not etched. Not embedded. Folded. Patterns at the submicron level. Self-similar. Recurring. Receding. A kind of design language that extended into itself, fractal in motion but static in form. Not symbolic. Not decorative. Functional, in a way that no one in the room could define. At first glance, it resembled faultless ornamentation, too precise to be random, too fluid to be entirely mechanical. But under polarized light, those patterns interacted with the scanner's own signal, refracting in a way that suggested response, not reflection. No moving parts, no circuits, no insulation. Just bare geometry. But it was doing something. The spectroscopic feedback produced harmonics in the terahertz band. Nothing audible, nothing dangerous, but enough to register as reactive. The fragment wasn't broadcasting. It was resisting silence. They tested magnetic field resistance, piezoelectric response, photonic dispersion. Each trial revealed minor but consistent modulation in the material structure. The lattice shifted, slightly but measurably, when exposed to non-ionizing radiation. It returned to its original state afterward, but not passively. It returned as if instructed. They weren't looking at a material. They were looking at a decision. It took 14 hours before someone suggested a term not used in that lab before. Not casually. Not publicly. Quantum resonance. Not as theory. Not as experiment. As observation. The lattice wasn't just stable at scale. It was relational. Each segment held its alignment irrespective of rotation, temperature, or field orientation. The fragment behaved as though it had memory. Not information encoded within, but a structural loyalty to a state it refused to abandon, even under transformation. The suggestion was dismissed. Then repeated. Then accepted. Quietly. Because denying it no longer preserved comfort. This was not future-adjacent technology. This was a form of engineering predicated on physical understanding not yet achieved. It wasn't ahead by decades. It was built on principles not yet named. That left them with a problem too large to classify. The object had been buried for over 40,000 years in an untouched sediment layer, but its fabrication belonged to a time no fabrication process could yet reach. Its behavior was predictive, its design intentional, its presence unjustifiable. They calibrated a final test. Atomic force microscopy at scale so fine that vibrations had to be mapped and cancelled in real time. The resulting topography showed no toolmark, no human origin, no process recognizable by any discipline. The surface tension at edge points was impossible. Every known material, under similar conditions, would fracture. This held. There was nothing left to interpret. Only a silence not from absence, but from rejection. The artifact was real. It was older than civilization, and it had not been made by any past we have known. That left one answer. It was from somewhere else. Not a place, a time. They moved to isotopic profiling, not out of expectation, but because nothing else remained. The structure had spoken in patterns they couldn't read, but atoms leave trails. Even the most inert substance betrays its origin when sliced deep enough. They drilled a pinhole into the alloy's interior, shielding against contamination, watching the counters flatten as if the fragment had never known energy. But it had. Buried in the composite were trace actinides, atoms heavy enough to fracture over time, to break themselves down in silence. Normally, such elements decay in measurable arcs. Their half-lives are known. Their curves predictable. They forget their mass in intervals, shedding themselves toward balance. This didn't. The first readings were quiet. Too quiet. Not inert. Not absent. Held. Where emission was expected to taper over millennia, it increased slightly under observation. Not erratic. Not chaotic. A gentle upward push against the decay slope. It wasn't gaining energy, but losing nothing. Like a clock unwilling to tick forward. Or ticking backward too slowly for certainty. The technician recalibrated the detector. Still the same slope. Not negative, not flat, just wrong. They brought in a second array. This one registered marginal emissions in the lower gamma range, but the decay rate skewed away from expected baselines. Where it should have followed the half-life of neptunium or americium, the breakdown instead curved in reverse. As if the process hadn't begun. As if it was waiting to begin. A theoretical physicist was called from Zurich's outer faculty. She examined the emission graphs with no expression, adjusted the baseline assumptions, and leaned into the display without speaking for a full minute. Then, she asked a question the others weren't ready to answer. What if the isotope was not early in its decay, but late in its formation? They reviewed the data again. If you reversed the direction of time on the graph, the emission made sense. Not as decay, but as synthesis. Not a particle losing cohesion, but acquiring it. As if its origin wasn't backward in time, but forward. As if it had not yet reached the moment when its decay would begin. No known environment could delay radiometric breakdown. No shielding, no compression, no temperature regime. Even in vacuum, even in 0 Kelvin projections, atomic decay remains constant. Entropy does not wait. It does not pause. It does not defer to design. Unless the particle's frame of reference was displaced. Unless its internal chronology had been set ahead of the world it was found in. Forward time drift. A phrase whispered more than written. The suggestion that certain materials, if moved from one temporal alignment to another, could retain the arrow of time they were forged within. That their decay would not respond to local time, but to the time of their origin. A kind of chronological inertia. If true, it would mean the object was not merely fabricated in the future. It was still, in some fundamental way, in the future. Particles that had not caught up to the present. A material that disagreed with its surroundings not through chemical incompatibility, but through temporal resistance. Not out of error, out of origin. They ran one final simulation, adjusted for the decay rate, projected the curve forward under normal entropy rules, applied the shift in particle state alignment. The result was quiet, unembellished, terrifying. The isotopes would begin to decay normally in approximately 112 years, meaning the process that forged them had occurred after that. Not long after. Not conceptually distant. Close. Within reach. The material was new. Not recent. New in the strictest sense. Not yet begun. They had not found something from the past. They were standing in the way of something arriving. It was never meant to be shared. The data had been stored offline, locked behind physical access, limited to 3 researchers under a confidentiality agreement that hadn't been formalized, only spoken. No signatures. Just the mutual understanding that certain results do not belong in circulation until they can be understood. Not out of fear, out of respect for consequence. But something changed. The technician who had handled the final decay curve analysis exported a copy of the dataset to a personal drive. Not maliciously. Not for gain. Just a moment of disbelief needing validation from elsewhere. He sent it to a colleague in Utrecht, framing it as an anomaly worth a second opinion. The file moved from inbox to inbox, each recipient more certain than the last that it couldn't be real. But no one deleted it. They forwarded it, quietly, carefully, until it wasn't quiet anymore. Within 72 hours, the dataset had appeared on a closed forum for theoretical physicists, encrypted, labeled unverified, accompanied by notes that only deepened the urgency. Impossible lattice integrity, non-random fractal structuring, reverse-skewed decay curves, unidentified actinide resonance. The discussion began in curiosity, then disbelief, then panic. Equations were posted, models built, reductions attempted. A few suggested experimental error. Most did not, because the data was too clean, too exact, too consistent with nothing anyone had ever seen. The argument wasn't whether it was fabricated. The argument was how it could exist. Someone tagged a former CERN consultant. She replied with 2 words, time leakage. The phrase was mocked, dissected, ignored. But it spread. Within a week, the forum was taken offline. Not archived. Deleted. Completely. The lab in Zurich reported a breach 2 days later. Unspecified. No hardware stolen, no damage to infrastructure. But access logs disappeared. Camera footage blank. The physical sample gone. No record of its removal. The technician who had exported the data was placed on indefinite suspension. No appeal. No explanation. Back in Montreal, the institution issued a statement clarifying its position. They had no affiliation with recent online rumors. They reiterated their commitment to rigorous science. They confirmed that no anomalous materials had been verified by their laboratories. Her name was not included. Not in the statement. Not in the minutes of the last faculty meeting. Not in the archive. The lab door was reassigned. Her research assistant was offered a transfer. Her tenure track dissolved without formal termination. It simply ended. Quietly. Efficiently. The remaining physical samples, including the sediment core and environmental swabs, were removed under directive from an unnamed federal agency. The chain of custody was sealed. No notification was provided. No questions answered. The sample room was sterilized. The file directory collapsed into an empty folder marked restructured. A final press release followed. Brief. Dry. Following internal review, the findings previously associated with the glacial anomaly have been deemed inconclusive. There is no credible evidence of anomalous materials. The university considers the matter closed. No names. No dates. No mention of the object at all. As if it had never passed through their hands. As if none of it had ever happened. But it had. And the only proof that remained was the silence that followed. Not the absence of truth, but the removal of space where truth could be spoken. Not denial. Erasure. He had no reason to be looking. The journal had been catalogued years ago, filed among regional accounts of Iberian mineral surveys from the early 1600s, hand-copied into archival vellum, its language uneven, its script weathered by time more than use. Most entries were mundane: measurements, terrain descriptions, mundane quarrels over land boundaries, inventories of common ores. Nothing of consequence, nothing valuable. But on the 76th page, beneath a record of a limestone fissure mapped near Córdoba, a single passage caught his attention. Not for what it claimed, but for what it didn't explain. A black ingot, unearthed from within a sealed chamber of stone 20 meters beneath the surface, described as smooth, cold, unnatural. No tool could mark it. No flame would mar it. Its weight was disproportionate, its shape unfamiliar. The miners who found it refused to handle it after the first attempt. It had no known purpose, no visible seams. It was not documented in any subsequent record. The entry ended with one line: "We buried it again." He translated the passage twice, once for accuracy, once for tone. It lacked exaggeration. It wasn't written as myth or parable. It had the restraint of someone who did not understand what they saw and chose not to pretend otherwise. It could have been disregarded. An embellishment, a mistake, a trick of light in a torchlit mine. Until he matched the measurements, roughly 13 centimeters, heavy, hard-edged, dark metallic, unyielding, the description aligned, and the formation, limestone densely packed, geologically sealed, predated industrial activity in the region. There had been no shafts deep enough for prior intrusion. No records of any previous excavation. The chamber, by all accounts, had been closed off for tens of thousands of years. Long before smelting. Long before tools could forge the material described. He requested access to the core samples taken from the mine site in 1964. Most had been discarded. A few survived in the National Archive, mislabeled as aggregate residue. Among them, a fragment of unclassified alloy sealed in silica. No sample ID. No metadata. He ran a surface scan. The patterns were faint. Nearly gone. But not erased. The same angular intersections. The same silence in the structure. It was not identical. But it was not different enough. He cross-referenced mineral alignment with the Canadian site. The composition of surrounding rock differed, but the stress signatures matched. Compressive stress layered with low-yield radiation flux. Tectonic compression zones beneath fault-bearing formations. Not an object out of time. A pattern. Which meant the impossible had repeated. Once is anomaly. Twice is alignment. The silence around the first object could be explained, suppressed, denied, forgotten. But this was different. This had waited longer. Spoken softer. It had not been placed. It had been trapped. Not by force, but by geological circumstance. The earth itself had held it there. So a question formed. Not how it arrived, but what the earth had done to it. He drafted a proposal under a name not his own, addressed to a private research trust, suggesting a study into unusual isotopic behaviors at tectonic intersections with measurable pressure gradients and anomalous quartz polarization. The language was clean. The implication buried beneath numbers. One term appeared. Once. Quietly. Chronotectonic anomaly. The idea that under precise, rare, and unrepeatable geological conditions, stress can induce temporary structural incoherence in local spacetime. Not rupture. Not travel. Distortion. Folded alignment between temporal domains under specific thresholds of pressure, temperature, and background radiation. The lithosphere not as container, but as gate. Not deliberate. Environmental. The Earth had not hidden something. It had caught it. The model began as a footnote, folded into the appendix of a grant proposal too technical for casual reading, too cautious for headlines. It wasn't written with conviction. It was written with restraint. The kind of restraint that comes when the evidence outweighs the assumptions, but the language hasn't caught up. The idea was simple. Not easy. Not proven. Just simple. Under extremely rare geophysical conditions, pressure exceeding 7 gigapascals, sustained for centuries, within subduction zones layered with silicate lattices, the stability of local spacetime may no longer be uniform. A fracture does not occur. Not in the tectonic sense. The crust doesn't split. Instead, the moment fractures, a temporal shear, where space remains continuous but time folds, briefly, without warning, without permanence, just long enough for something positioned at the edge of that distortion to fall through. Not vanish, not accelerate, shift, dragged into a frame where the coordinates match, but the clock does not. Dislocated not by design but by resonance. Adrift across causality through a fault line that does not belong to any map, but to a set of pressures the Earth rarely applies. The object did not arrive through invention. It arrived through condition. It wasn't built to cross time. It was built to measure ground. And something beneath that ground, pressed hard enough, for long enough, in a lattice rigid enough to catch the signal, pulled it backward through the skin of causality without tearing it. The implications refused containment. If local spacetime could shear without rupture, then matter could be realigned by sequence rather than position. The question was no longer whether something could be sent through time. The question was whether the Earth, without intention, had already created the mechanism to receive it. Not as a function. As a consequence, there were historical earthquake records that coincided with unexplained magnetic anomalies. Lab notes from the mid-20th century referencing spontaneous isotopic drift in borehole samples. Data dismissed, shelved, attributed to contamination or calibration drift. But taken together, they suggested something more. Moments when the planet didn't just shift in space but in chronology, where past and future touched. Not completely, not evenly, but just enough to permit passage. Not of information. Not of people. Of presence. Matter, dislodged from its origin, deposited out of sequence, not through force, but through misalignment. A geological misfire that reordered causality without breaking physical law. Once, it might have meant nothing. Twice, it became a pattern. The folds couldn't be mapped, but they could be modeled. Their formation required three things: crushing subduction pressure at fault convergence, high-energy radiation flux from natural uranium decay or external exposure, and a crystalline structure capable of reflecting and holding vibrational harmonics long enough to trap resonance. In combination, these conditions might distort local chronology within a radius too small to be noticed. Unless something fell into it, and something had. Not by accident. By intersection. Not because someone wanted it to arrive here. Because it no longer had a choice. Because time, under pressure, had opened a door it was never meant to own. They looked at the surface again, not with light but with heat. Low-band infrared, tuned to reveal thermal absorption patterns rather than emissions. It wasn't standard protocol. It wasn't even procedure. But the alloy had already denied every known method of translation, every conventional approach to inscription or mark. The surface was silent under pressure, silent under touch, silent under charge. So they altered the question. Not what could be seen. What might remain. The markings came first as shadows, barely there. A sequence of faint impressions buried in the surface coating, too shallow for texture, too recent for oxidation, but too deliberate to be dismissed. The geometry was angular, ordered without symmetry, patterned without repetition. It looked like no script. It obeyed no linguistic form. But it wasn't random. They mapped the spacing, ran comparison models, checked for repetition cycles, mapped it again. Coordinates. Not written in decimal, not in standard notation, but in positional triads tied to elevation, subduction depth, and axial rotation. It wasn't where the object had been found. It was where it had meant to go. There were 6 sets. spread across what is now uninhabited terrain. 4 were in oceanic fault zones, 1 beneath polar ice, 1 in a continental interior too deep for any current drilling array. No identifying marks, no legends, just points locked in place by time and silence. They converted the figures against the planetary precession, ran the math forward. The coordinates matched sites that did not yet exist, not in shape, in purpose. Each location corresponded with projected zones for long-term core access, regions identified by future planning groups as stable targets for deep Earth sampling. Locations selected not yet for today, but for what might be required in 50 years. Possibly more. No one had disclosed these projections publicly. The models existed in closed research circles, the kind of initiatives that chart timelines decades in advance for missions not yet funded, using technologies not yet built. And yet the object carried them, etched beneath its surface before its casing had ever been exposed to sunlight. It was a probe, not in the traditional sense, not a craft, not a message, a recorder, something designed to be embedded, not discovered. Something meant to be lowered into regions humans had not yet reached, to measure, transmit, archive, or return. But it hadn't reached those places. It had been caught, drawn into a temporal fracture and misplaced not by years, but by millennia. It had not failed. It had been intercepted by a condition it could not have known existed. It was not here to warn. It was not here to reveal. It was here by mistake. But even mistakes can speak. It carried data no one could yet interpret, material compositions that reflected minerals not yet uncovered, heat resistance beyond any documented threshold, a shielding mechanism that adapted to resonance rather than force. It was not advanced in scale. It was advanced in understanding, built to endure pressures we have not yet reached, to answer questions we have not yet formed, constructed by a species not more intelligent, but further along in its patience. Whatever future had created it had not designed it to be noticed, only to be placed, quietly, deeply, permanently, and when it slipped through the fold, the future it was built for continued without it, unaware of the loss, or unable to retrieve it, and so it waited, not for us, for the place it was meant to measure, for the world not yet prepared to meet it, for conditions that would never arrive because the Earth had made a decision the designers could not have predicted, a fracture in time that swallowed something whole, not to change the past, only to forget the future. The question had always been whether time moved in one direction because it must, or because we chose to see it that way. The object forced a third possibility. What if time moves as space does? Not in a line, but shaped by terrain. What if the terrain is not celestial, not gravitational, not atomic, but buried deep in the Earth itself, written in pressure, temperature, and the unacknowledged violence of geology? What if time, under rare conditions, folds the way rock bends, tight, silent, irreversible? This was no longer about physics. Physics has rules. This was about knowing. And knowing is built on assumptions. Causality is not one of them. Causality is the assumption, the first principle, that cause precedes effect, that action produces consequence, that the arrow of time points forward, no matter how the world spins. But the object said otherwise. It had arrived before its own purpose had been defined. It carried instructions written after the soil had already sealed it away. Its decay had not begun because the moment it was forged had not yet arrived. It was not a relic. It was not ancient. It was unfinished. And if that was true, then everything we rely on to separate fact from fiction began to uncoil. Not unravel, not collapse, uncoil. As though it had always been wrapped around something we refuse to name. Knowledge built on order cannot survive disorder that still functions. An object from the future, existing in the past, behaving by rules it should not possess, is not a curiosity. It is an indictment. If an artifact can arrive before it is created, then effect no longer requires cause. Observation no longer requires precedent. Discovery no longer depends on time. And that means information, data, instruction, signal, can exist independently of origin. The moment that is supposed to begin at the end of something else might begin without it, or worse, because of it. The discovery was no longer an anomaly. It was a violation, and not just of chronology, of thought. Institutions that exist to ask questions closed their doors. Laboratories that once competed to publish findings retracted their abstract. Facilities that had quietly launched parallel investigations into unexplained isotopic anomalies began erasing trails. Equipment was reassigned. Grant renewals paused. Names vanished from authorship. Screens went dark. But silence is not the same as absence. In Tokyo, a private firm quietly submitted a patent for a thermal-isolated spectrometer capable of reading temporal alignment across pressure gradient. In Munich, a closed-door colloquium amended the definition of measurement uncertainty to include hypothetical temporal bias. In New Mexico, a classified dig beneath a known fault line extended its deadline for unexplained geological delays. No one claimed to be looking. No one admitted they had found anything. But they had. And none of them had spoken. Not because the truth was too large. Because the shape of it left no room for language. The object was never meant to be found. It had no message. No instruction. No warning. It held no secret waiting to be unlocked, no reward for discovery. It had not arrived with intention. It had arrived because something deeper than choice had made space for it. Time did not move for it. Time opened. And the opening was not engineered. It was geological. We have mapped mountains by their shape. We have dated stones by their decay. We have written history along the ridgelines of tectonic drift, measuring distance as a story told in sediment and fracture. But beneath all of it there may be something we never considered. Not space. Sequence. The places where the crust folds are not just sites of collision. They are pressure points on something older than geography. The ground may shift, but so might the moment. And when those two shifts intersect, there is no law that says cause must continue before effect. There is no rule that guarantees time will remain loyal to itself. The object is proof of nothing. It makes no claim. But it refuses denial. It tells us that not everything that arrives must come from behind us. It tells us that the past is not sealed. It tells us that discovery may not be linear, and that some knowledge does not wait to be earned. If there are other objects, they may already be buried. Not hidden. Not placed. Pulled. Drawn into folds no sensor has been built to detect, scattered across a planet that never needed us to understand it to function. We measure what we can. We model what we fail to grasp. But something has shifted. Not in the data. In the ground beneath it. What we thought was the past may include echoes of the future, buried not by intention, but by fault. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.